our next action item in the agenda is creation of workspaces. Once you log into Azure, this would be a home screen, like we were discussing in our previous call. Once you're on this home screen, either search for Azure Databricks on your search bar, or it would typically be inside your Azure services. If you can't find it on your favorites list, the best thing to do is search for Azure Databricks on your search bar. And once it appears, this would be your empty home screen. Ideally, you won't be seeing any workspaces. If you have created one, yes, you might see one, but by default, this would be an empty space. So to get started, you need to click on this Let's Create. Okay, this will help you, or this will allow you to create an Azure Databricks workspace inside your Azure subscription to which your Azure Databricks account is associated with or will be associated with. Okay, so when you click on this Azure workspace, by default, you'll again have an Azure subscription on which you are typically billed for any Azure resources or Databricks account that you're creating or supposed to create. Okay, this subscription is on which you'll be billed, and you have got $80 credit for this subscription, which means that for the next 6 weeks of program, we are supposed to work, or we are supposed to use this $80 limited budget. Okay, how Databricks is going to bill us is something I'm going to show a very quick brief, or I'm going to give a very quick pricing example how Databricks is going to charge us. So that is something we'll be discussing towards the end of our discussion today. Okay, so when you land onto this page, you can use the default value that is here, which is your Azure subscription. Then we will not be having any resource groups, or let me please allow you to first brief what exactly are these resource groups. So what Azure says is that any service or any resource you create that might belong to a specific project. So tomorrow when you are moving into a client deployment, the idea was that you might create hundreds or thousands of resources. I mean, 1,000 would be an exaggeration, but you might be creating tens or hundreds of resources which might belong to a specific project. Now, if you're working on 2 or 3 or 5 projects which are under same subscription, it's better to have a clear line of boundary between each set of resources belonging to different projects. So what Azure says is that any resource that you create that might belong to a specific project, let's put them under same boundary or a same group called resource group. It's a sort of a logical folder, logical separation that you're using to add all related resources to a specific project. So it's just like you creating a folder and then adding multiple files in the same folder. So you can click on Create New and then give a name here. So let me say Soma DB WSKP. This is something we were also discussing previously. Okay, that would be the name of the resource group in which your Databricks subscriptions or Databricks workspace would be added to. Then you're supposed to give a name of this Databricks workspace, which should be universally unique. Okay, so find a good name that is unique and add it to the workspace. But at the same time, as I was saying, the best practice suggests that you add your project name, a project ID, and then the relatable or actionable workspace name while you're creating your workspace. Because once the workspace is created, you're not allowed to change your workspace names. Okay, so provide a good and explainable workspace name. Then, just like we know, Databricks is part of Azure Cloud, and Azure Cloud is universal again, right? Azure has got several data centers across the world. Now, what you're seeing here, region, suggests that the Databricks account that you're going to create or Databricks workspace that you're going to create is going to be part of East US region. Now, there is one important point to note here. What Databricks or Azure suggests is that if there will not be any international ingress or egress. What I mean by that is, for example, if you have a data center in East US, okay, and you have a data lake or a database in India, for example, when you try to access this data, what it means is that US East is in one region, whereas India is entirely a different region. These are from 2 different data centers, which also means that there is inter-region data transfer that is going to happen. Because of which, what Azure or Databricks says is that it might cost us. So what Azure or Databricks says is that as a best practice, you need to put or choose the location of your Databricks workspace which is strategically and logically closer to where your workloads might run or exist. For example, all of your workloads run within India region and your data is also within India region. So what they say is that while you're creating Databricks workspace, it's better to choose India over US East region. That is how we take a call when you're supposed to deploy a workspace in an actual client project. But in our context, you're only restricted to use US East region, considering that we are in a learning setup right now, and US East region prices are comparatively little less when compared to India. Which also brings me to the point that these pricings might vary from region to region. Why? That's exactly how Azure does it. And because the Databricks we are working with is tightly integrated with Azure, the idea says or idea suggests that depending on the region, your cost might slightly vary. Okay, so to reiterate, you are supposed to deploy your Azure Databricks workspaces in US East region. Okay, that's second part. So I'm choosing US East. Moving on to pricing tier, which is one of the most important discussions I want to spend some time on. You see, you typically have three kinds of pricing tiers: a standard, a premium, and a trial. Trial is something which is self-explanatory, but I want to spend some time talking about standard and premium. You see, first part of our program will be spending or will be using standard workspace, whereas the second part will be using premium. Why? There is a slight difference between these two. As you might expect or guess, premium workspace includes several additional features that support your Databricks or data engineering workloads and will give you an added benefit. Okay. For example, when we move on to clusters, I will talk about something called as how your cluster is supposed to be shared. This is something I will talk about, but what it suggests is that in premium, there are some additional features that you might actually experience which are lacking in standard tier. Okay. What premium tier also offers you is something called as role-based access control. Let me spend a quick moment in explaining what exactly is this role-based access control with a quick example. For example, you see, I'm Soma, and I'm currently working on a project which requires some credentials to be masked. No one wants to share credentials openly, so I want my credentials to be masked, for which I will use something called as an identity, a secret identity, and I will mask my credential. Okay. Now, question is that who can access this masked credential? Can everyone who has access to my workspace access this? Or is it just me who is going to access? Can everyone who is having access to the workspace have same privilege as that of me? What I mean by that is, I'm the creator of this credential. Can everyone else who is part of my workspace access, delete, create everything on this credential? Or is it that they should have access to only read it, but they're not supposed to create or delete this credential? So in simple terms, any identity or a person that you talk about, what they can and can't do on top of this credential is defined by something called as role. This role-based access control is something you will have in premium workspaces, but not in standard workspace. But please do not worry. We will do a deep dive on this when we actually talk about creation of premium workspaces. But for now, what we need to understand is that we'll have to go with standard. Now, there is also an important point to make here. Between standard tier and premium tier, as you might have guessed, there is a pricing difference. For example, you're running a sample ETL workload, and if this ETL workload takes $1 per hour in standard, the same ETL workload might take, let's say, $2.5 per hour in premium workspace. So between standard and premium, even if you're running the same workload, there is a pricing difference. The reason is that what Databricks says is, because we are offering you additional features, irrespective of whether you use it or not, we are going to charge you that additional premium when compared to standard. So point to notice, there are feature differences between standard tier and premium tier. At the same time, the pricing is not same for standard and premium. Okay, so let's move on to a quick pricing example and see that very quickly. I hope you can see my pricing calculator as of now. Can you please confirm if yes?
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So Where are we deploying? We are trying to deploy Azure Databricks in East US region. And what kind of workload are we running? There are several types of workloads. We'll very quickly talk about them when we get into cluster creation. But for now, assume you're creating an all-purpose compute. We'll talk about what exactly is this all-purpose compute. Let's say we are going to create a standard account or standard pricing tier. And if you have remembered our discussion on architecture, what did we say? What we have mentioned is that the infrastructure is coming from Azure, which is our cloud subscription, whereas the entire control is with Databricks. So this instance or this server that we are talking about, or the virtual machine we are talking about, is actually from Azure, but not Databricks. So this D3V2 is with Azure subscription, which is going to be controlled by your Databricks account. For example, this is what you have chosen. And you're going to use this for 730 hours in a given month. Now, if you see the price of this is $213. Okay. On top of which, there is something called as Databricks unit, which is $219. So when you create your Databricks account and use this virtual machine as your compute capacity to run, let's say pandas read underscore CSV or Spark read underscore format, what happens is that you're going to make use of this compute just like your CPU of your laptop to execute these workloads, for which you are paying $213 for Azure. Sorry, you're paying $432 for Azure, out of which $213 will go to Azure and $219 will go to Databricks. Because what Databricks says is that for this specific server, I'm going to charge you a packaged value called 0.75 Databricks units. Okay. Per Databricks unit, I'm going to charge you $0.4 out of 730, that multiplied by 730 hours, which comes down to $219. So this $219 is what Azure gives down to Databricks, and what Azure charges from you is $432. Now, pay extra attention to this specific value, $0.4. Now, when I change this standard tier to pricing tier, sorry, the premium tier, you see, this has remained the same, but earlier the $0.4 that you have seen has now become $0.55 per DPU per hour. The reason is that the pricing difference, there's a clear pricing difference between your standard tier and your premium tier. It's the same 0.7 Databricks units. It's the same 730 hours, but per DPU charge per hour has now become 0.55 instead of 0.4 when it's the case for standard, but when it's the case for premium, it's 0.5. Okay, so between the standard tier and premium tier, there are feature differences as well as your pricing difference. What you will be paying to Azure is the entire $515, out of which Azure will be passing down $301 to Databricks. That is how your pricing and billing will typically work. Okay, so coming back, we are supposed to choose standard tier. And finally, this is an optional field, but let me explain what is the need or what is the meaning of it. Okay, so when you say resource group name, that you have seen here, this what it suggests is that every resource you're creating towards a project is something that will be added here. But Databricks, while creating it, will create some of its own services, right? Which will only be managed by Azure. Sorry, which will be only managed by Databricks under Azure rules. Those resources which you cannot control directly and can only be controlled through Databricks will be added to this managed resource group name. So if you do not give any name, it will automatically add a name, which is same as that of your workspace name. Okay, so I'm going to leave that empty and I'm going to move forward. There are some more settings which are not really important for us to understand, but I'm going to very quickly walk you through them. For example, if you need to understand networking and you do not want to have everyone access this specific Databricks workspace. Right now, what's happening is that because we do not have any network setup, we are going to keep this as no and no. But for instance, tomorrow when your client says that I only want someone who is connected to my network should be accessing this Databricks workspace. Not everyone and anyone in the world should access this workspace. Only those who are connected to my network, to my internet, should access this workspace. If someone says that, then you're supposed to enable these features, enable this setup, say yes and S here, and then proceed with Databricks workspace creation. But that's not the case with us. We do not have a standard workspace setup. We do not have a VPN with us in general as a crowd. So what we are doing is we are going to keep no and no here. and proceed with the next set of fields, which is encryption. So encryption here primarily talks about any data that is added to your control space, that is Databricks UX. Whether should that be encrypted or not? Would you like to manage your own keys for encryption? That is what is determined by these things. Okay. So tags are very quick a key value page that talks about why you're creating this specific workspace or resource, what was the need for it, and who's going to manage this. So any details that are going to talk about your workspace, so on and so forth, is what you are seeing under tags. And finally, when you click on review and create, it is going to say whether you can actually create this workspace or not. Now, from the perspective of our journey, the Databricks, other than your basics details that you're seeing here, none of the other fields are very important for us. And in the real world, even you won't be creating these Databricks workspaces directly. There will be an administrator who will be assisting you in creation of this workspace. But since we are supposed to do hands-on, I just wanted to give you a very quick walkthrough on how you're supposed to create workspaces. To summarize, all you need to fill is the basics details, choose the default subscription, give a new resource group, create a workspace, choose East US region, and give a standard present tier. Click on review and create, and then just click on create once your validation is done. So I'm going to click on this workspace that was already created for me. When I get into this workspace, this is how you're going to see your screen. Okay. You need to click on something called as launch workspace. But there are several settings that you are seeing on the left blade of your Databricks workspace account. There's something called as access control or IAM. This determines how a person X, a resource X, is supposed to access this workspace. What they can do and cannot do in this workspace. That is determined through this something called as access control or IAM. But then again, this is not really relevant or important for us in the purview of our certification. But in your real world, in your client projects, when you're deployed into or when you're working towards, typically these are managed by your Azure administrators or Databricks administrators. Okay. So we have several such features on virtual network peering, which again talks about how or which networks can access this workspace, so on and so forth. But what we are really interested in when you create your workspace is clicking on something called as launch workspace, which will be your first step into the world of Databricks workspace. Perfect. We are in.